Hey guys, it hasn't been that long since I posted, right? Okay, I guess I have missed a little bit of stuff since my last video, so you know what, let's just speedrun this. Madam Web, garbage. I was actually going to make a video on how bad it was, but it was so bad to the point where I didn't even care to talk about it anymore. In the video, I was also going to go over Sony Marvel movies and how they really just have no idea what they're doing and just no general direction for any sort of connected franchise. And even if that's not what they're going for, the movies are still just trash. But hey, maybe I'll have that discussion when Craven comes out later this year. Dune Part 2, the best movie of the decade. I saw it twice in IMAX, and while I could have made a video, people would have just said that I was glazing the movie the whole time, which, like, I mean, whatever, I just love it so much. But yeah, I think I'd be accused of drinking the blue Fanta water of life, and people would probably tell me to hop off of Dune's worm. To which I say, silence! The last thing I quote-unquote missed more recently was the Oscars. I never planned to cover it, but there's still some notable things. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse was completely snubbed for animated feature film. The I'm Just Ken performance might be the best thing that I've ever seen in my entire life, and Oppenheimer deserved to sweep and get all of the awards that it did. Hey, that wasn't too bad. Anyways, now that we speed ran that faster than my use of the Dune popcorn bucket after seeing John Cena at the Oscars, let's talk about Kung Fu Panda 4. For context, at the end of last year, I did release a video on Kung Fu Panda 4, kind of going over my initial thoughts on the film, a lot of my hesitations, and the things that I was looking forward to. I'm going to be directly referencing back to that to see kind of how I feel about the movie now that I've actually seen the movie. But just to briefly summarize that video so that you're all caught up, just in general, I really liked the Kung Fu Panda trilogy. I think it's one of the better animated trilogies that we've ever gotten. I love the characters, the stories, the villains are definitely a standout. I don't think it's on the same level as something like the How to Train Your Dragon trilogy, but still, these movies just meant a lot to my childhood. And when I heard that they were releasing Kung Fu Panda 4, I was hesitant, to say the least. Coming back to this franchise a decade later just didn't really feel like the right move. Regardless, I still like all three of the movies in the original trilogy, and I had faith that DreamWorks would deliver again. And I was so passionate about my concerns and my hopes for the movie that I made an entire video on it. So that's your quick recap. Now let's get into it. The first positive that I brought up in my original video had to do with the villains. I just feel like I had to discuss this considering the Kung Fu Panda trilogy has some of the best animated villains of all time in my opinion. So with this fourth film, we of course have a fourth addition to the villains of this franchise. This time, the Chameleon, voiced by Viola Davis, which is absolutely phenomenal casting. I just want to point that out. First of all, we've seen a lot of her work, not in animated movies, but in a lot of live action movies, and I feel like she can embody a villain so incredibly well. I also love the idea of her powers, which is the fact that she can go back and basically snatch the souls of previous villains, or in some cases, our heroes, and then embody them and have their powers as well. As I said, a villain should be a balance between just pure awesomeness and also emotion underlying it, and I feel like this power of the Chameleon embodies both of them perfectly. So yeah, I was mistaken. To start off with the positive side of things, I was happy with Viola Davis's performance. I feel like she did a good job, or at least as good of a job as she could do with what she was given. But truthfully, her character is so wasted in this film. All of that emotional potential of being able to change into other characters or past villains, and they don't utilize it in any interesting way at all. And on top of just like not being cool or rooted in any sort of emotional way, her motives just as a villain are terrible. She's really just like a nothing villain. Now, admittedly, was it cool to see the previous villains come back in some capacity? Sometimes. Tai Lung definitely does get a good scene, but even in the end of the movie, they really did take a huge misstep in my opinion that felt really out of character for him. And to top it all off, none of the other villains even have voice lines. They're just kind of like there, but nothing interesting actually happens with them being there. So yeah, Viola Davis was good enough, as good as she could be, but just a really wasted villain, especially when you compare it to the others in this franchise. The next positive I discussed in my video was the Kung Fu Panda trilogy. I like it, simple as that. The villains we just talked about I think are amazing in the original trilogy. The cast is great, with Jack Black being a standout. The side characters are awesome, like the Furious Five. There's just so many things that I could point out that are just really great about the original trilogy. The point is, I love these movies, and some of them mean a lot to me and my childhood. The fact that we're getting a fourth film is awesome, and I just hope to experience those same nostalgic feelings all over again. Okay, so I'll start off with the bad here. The fact that we basically don't have the Furious Five is really upsetting. They even go out of their way to make an excuse for why they aren't there. It felt very similar to when the Super Mario Bros. Movie shoehorned in a way to excuse Mario not having as much of an Italian accent, which is like, fine, it's just weird when they go so far out of their way to point it out, and we know that the movie would be so much better if they just did it correctly. Now, on a more positive note, I do think this movie generally did a good job of capturing that Kung Fu Panda feeling. I think a lot of this is carried by Jack Black and just his charisma of the character, because even though they changed a lot of things about the feel of this movie or about the villain, he still stays consistent, and I really do appreciate that. So it feels like a Kung Fu Panda movie, which feels like a dumb thing to say. I'm just trying to give credit where it's due. The third positive I talked about in my video was about DreamWorks as an animation studio, and this is a tough one, especially after I just recently rewatched Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, or should I say Puss in Peak? No? I'm sorry. When I think of my favorite childhood animated movies, the movies that come to mind are typically just like super fun or cool films. When I was younger, and I think that a lot of people can relate to this, the way that I view a movie from an emotional standpoint is different. I wanted it to give me certain emotions. The feeling that I would chase is simply joy from seeing something that I thought was awesome. Kung Fu Panda gave me that exact feeling, which is why it stands out when it comes to animated films. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish is a great example of this. It's just an awesome movie with a cool animation style, and yet there is still a message underneath that about the value of life and the loved ones that you have around you. It strikes the perfect balance of having a message but just being a genuinely fun film to watch. All of that is to say that DreamWorks has stayed consistent, knowing when they need to balance awesome and emotion. Yeah, so maybe they aren't always the best at this. I honestly feel like they rushed the script for Kung Fu Panda 4, and I don't know how long it's been since like the beginning of production and the writing process until now, but it really just feels like there's a lack of care when you put this film up against the others in the franchise. The story is essentially about Po learning to embrace change as he continues on his journey, but the problem with it is that they don't do anything interesting with it. They just take such a generic approach, on top of making his character worse in some ways, but we'll discuss that later. Jumping into the negatives from my video, the first topic I discussed was reliance on nostalgia. In the case of this film, from what we know, the main nostalgia that I'm referring to is having the new villain, Chameleon, be able to steal the souls of other villains and take their form. Now, as I already discussed in my positives, I love the villains in this franchise and I cannot wait to see them return. However, with a fourth new villain in the franchise, I want them to continue that trend and give us a new amazing villain to add to the list. Again, I talked in my positives about how I think that Chameleon's power is really fascinating and could lead to a lot of cool things and potential emotional depth. But my worry is that giving your new villain the ability to embody past villains, you undermine your new villain. Because instead of viewing it as the chameleon messing with our characters, we might view it as Tai Lung messing with our new characters. Will that actually make Chameleon an interesting villain, or will we like it just because we get to see Tai Lung? Yeah, so I was dead wrong about this. Turns out this movie went in the complete opposite direction. They barely used any of the previous villains, and they didn't even have some of our main characters return. In my original video, I discussed how nostalgia needs to be used well and not just nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. Turns out they didn't want to use nostalgia at all, to the point where they were cutting out main characters that just should have been there anyways. As I said in my original video, given the Chameleon's powers in this movie, I feel like they could have tied our previous villains or other characters, they could have tied them into the story in an emotionally rich and interesting way. And instead, They just do nothing with it. The second negative I brought up in my original video is that new elements were concerning. So let's say that they don't rely on nostalgia too much and they actually handle that very well. Even if that's the case, I am worried about some of the new things that they're bringing into this film. The official IMDb summary of the movie is as follows, quote, "After Poe is tapped to become the spiritual leader of the Valley of Peace, he needs to find and train a new dragon warrior while a wicked sorceress plans to resummon all the master villains whom Poe has vanquished to the spirit realm," end quote. For starters, I do like the idea of Poe's journey continuing and him becoming that guy even more than he was before. However, the idea that there is a next dragon warrior is really weird to my childhood, I guess. I don't know if this is just me, but the idea of the dragon warrior was so sacred in the first film. It seemed prestigious. And I'll be honest, I always thought that that title only went to one individual, the dragon warrior. And in this case, that would be Poe, and that would stay Poe. The idea that it can just be passed down to another character seems weird, and I was absolutely correct. It feels really weird that Poe is supposed to be retiring from being the dragon warrior. They give an explanation for why that's supposed to happen. It doesn't really make it any better for me. And yeah, this new character that they introduced who's supposedly going to be the next dragon warrior, I just personally don't see it. And hey, maybe the movie was trying to teach me a lesson just like Poe was trying to open his eyes to change. Maybe I need to do that as well. Yeah, that's a joke, by the way. I am not okay with this change. Truthfully, I just don't like the direction they took this story. They needed a really good reason for making a fourth film, and what they ended up giving us was just not it. Kung Fu Panda 4 should have been amazing. It had so many reasons to be, but it's not. It's not good, and I'm just genuinely upset that it isn't better. You know what I need? I need a second Dune popcorn bucket and a third rewatch of Dune Part 2 to truly cleanse myself from this disappointment.